Imagine the year is 1845. The air in rural Maine is thick with the kind of silence that doesn't bring peace, but dread. The silence that makes every crunch of leaves underfoot sound like a warning. The forests stretch endlessly. Dark pines, leaning over crooked dirt roads, their branches clawing at the sky as though hiding secrets no one dares to speak aloud. And at the heart of this wilderness lay a village so small most maps never bothered to mark it. It was a place people stumbled upon, not a place they sought. Travelers who happened to pass through often described it the same way: quiet, unsettling, and strangely absent of children's laughter. But behind the closed shutters and locked doors of this tiny village, there was one name whispered in fear, one tale that turned even the most faithful churchgoers pale. The Four Sisters. No one knew exactly when the story began, only that by 1845, the legend had already taken root. It wasn't written in any official record, not spoken about in polite company, and certainly not acknowledged by any scientist or physician of the time. But to the people who lived in those woods, the story of the Four Sisters wasn't just folklore. It was survival. The first sightings, according to villagers, the Four Sisters lived deep in the forest, far beyond the last farmhouse, in a decaying homestead most avoided after dusk. Some swore they were human once, daughters of a lumberman and his wife who settled there decades earlier. Others whispered they were never human at all, just shadows in the shape of girls. But nearly everyone agreed on one thing: they came at night. Woodcutters spoke of hearing singing while they worked late, voices rising from the trees, soft and sweet at first, before shifting into something shrill, inhuman. Hunters told of seeing four pale figures standing together in a line, always just out of reach of the lantern's glow, their faces blurred, their bodies unmoving. And then, there were the disappearances. Between 1837 and 1845, no fewer than 12 villagers vanished. Men, women, even a child. Search parties combed the woods, but the only clues they ever found were scraps of torn clothing and footprints that seemed to end abruptly, as if the forest itself had swallowed them whole. When locals whispered about these vanishings, they always said the same thing: the sisters took them. The sisters' appearance descriptions varied, but a chilling pattern emerged. The eldest was said to have black hair so long it dragged across the ground, her face hidden behind it, her eyes visible only when she tilted her head. The second was described as eerily tall, her limbs unnaturally thin, her mouth too wide when she smiled. The third was small, childlike in size, but with the voice of a grown woman. She was often heard before she was seen. And the youngest was never clearly described. People who saw her claimed their memory of her face was erased the moment they looked away. No matter the account, one detail remained constant: they were always together. 4 figures, 4 shadows, 4 voices drifting through the woods like a hymn of death. Fear in the village. By the spring of 1845, the village was unraveling. Families abandoned their homes, livestock was found mutilated, and gatherings at the church turned into desperate prayer sessions to keep the sisters at bay. Children were forbidden from playing outside after sunset, and doors were bolted before the last light left the sky. Even stranger was the way people claimed to hear the sisters inside their homes. Scratches on the windows, the sound of fingernails tapping across wooden walls, and the soft creak of floorboards as if someone, or 4 someones, were walking just out of sight. One widow swore she woke to see all 4 of them standing at the foot of her bed. By morning, she was gone. Only the indentations on the floorboards remained, shaped like 4 sets of bare feet. The forbidden house, in the center of the forest, half hidden by pine and oak, was the house most connected to the sisters. Locals called it Hollow House. A crumbling, Cabin with its roof caving in, its windows shattered, and its door hanging crookedly on rusted hinges. Children dared one another to get close, but even the bravest never crossed the threshold. They said the walls were lined with symbols carved into the wood, not in English but in something older. They said voices echoed inside even when no one was there. They said anyone who entered was marked, and within 3 nights would disappear forever. Travelers from outside towns sometimes laughed at these stories. A group of loggers once ventured inside, mocking the villagers for their superstition. 3 days later, only one returned, raving mad, unable to speak anything coherent except a single phrase he repeated until his death. They don't like the light. The unexplainable evidence, while the world outside Maine moved forward, cities industrializing, railroads expanding, the mystery of the Four Sisters remained locked in whispered folklore. Scientists never studied it, newspapers never reported it, and skeptics brushed it off as hysteria, yet pieces of evidence lingered. In old family Bibles, pressed between pages of Psalms, were notes about strange deaths. In diaries, villagers described seeing 4 shapes reflected in mirrors, though no one else was in the room. Even in parish records, priests scribbled about parishioners claiming to hear voices during sermons, voices that didn't belong to any living person. By late 1845, the story of the sisters wasn't just a rumor. It was a curse. Why science refuses, perhaps the strangest part of this entire tale, isn't the mystery itself, but how thoroughly it has been ignored. Other historical mysteries, witch trials, ghost sightings, strange murders, have been studied, debated, dissected. But the case of the Four Sisters in Maine, it remains a shadow in history, a story science refuses to even acknowledge. Why? Some say it's because the evidence was too little, too fragile, too rooted in folklore. Others whisper that the lack of study isn't by accident at all, that the sisters were real, and those who got too close to their story were silenced. Even today, more than 170 years later, there are corners of Maine where locals still tell the tale, their eyes darting to the woods as though expecting 4 figures to step out of the tree line at any moment. Because while the world has moved on, the whispers in the forest have not, and the mystery of the Four Sisters remains unsolved. The story did not fade when the sun went down. If anything, that was when the unease grew stronger, when the wind that rustled through the pines seemed to carry voices that did not belong to the living. In 1845, the villagers of that forgotten Maine settlement spoke little after dark, because to speak was to be heard, and to be heard was to invite their attention. The Four Sisters. That year, spring arrived late. The river swelled with meltwater, and the fields stayed too damp for planting. The villagers spent their days repairing homes battered by winter storms, patching fences, and preparing for the warmer months that always seemed too short. But underneath their daily chores was a simmering dread, for every year without fail, the sisters returned in the thaw. No one knew why. Some claimed the warming air woke them, as if they had slept beneath the snow all winter long. Others believed they walked the woods year-round, but grew louder in the spring, more daring, more present, because something about the thaw weakened the boundaries between the world of the living and whatever place they came from. That spring, the warnings began the same way they always did. The animals knew first. Farmers complained that their cows refused to graze near the tree line, that chickens clucked and squawked through the night for no reason, that dogs howled at invisible shapes, lurking in the shadows. One man's horse bolted in the middle of the night, breaking its tether and galloping into the forest, never to be found. He followed its tracks the next morning and swore he saw not 1 set of prints but 5, 4 human, barefoot, and 1 belonging to the horse, until all of them ended in the middle of a clearing, where the ground was undisturbed, as though none of them had ever been there at all. The villagers gathered in hushed meetings at the church, discussing what should be done. Should they leave the village altogether? Some families had already done so, abandoning their farms in the dead of night, wagons rattling away before dawn. Those who remained feared that leaving might draw more attention, that the sisters might follow. Better to stay, they reasoned, and follow the old rules. Never answer a voice you hear in the woods after sundown. Never open the door if someone knocks more than 3 times. Never look directly into their eyes if you see them, because that was how they chose you. But rules could not always save you. The first disappearance that spring was a young woman named Margaret Hale. She had gone to fetch water from the well, near her home at dusk. And when her husband returned from the barn, the bucket lay on its side, water spilled across the dirt. But Margaret was gone. Neighbors swore they heard singing just before the sun dipped below the horizon, though no one admitted to seeing anything. Search parties scoured the woods until dawn, but there was no trace of her. No footprints, no torn dress, nothing. Her husband sat in the church the next day, rocking back and forth, whispering that he could still hear her voice calling his name. But he dared not answer. Only 3 nights later, another man vanished. This one was older, a trapper who lived on the edge of the settlement. His cabin was found with the door flung open, his dinner still warm on the table. The only sign of struggle was the scratch marks on the wooden frame of his bed, deep and jagged, as though someone had clawed the wood with unnatural strength. Some villagers believed he had simply left, wandered off into the forest, never to return. But the trappers who knew him best insisted he would never leave without his rifle, which still leaned against the wall of his cabin. And then came the stories of the voices. A child claimed she heard her mother calling from the woods one night, though her mother was asleep beside her. When asked what the voice had said, the girl's answer was simple. It had begged her to follow, to come play with the other girls. Another man swore he woke to the sound of his dead wife's voice outside his window, whispering his name, again and again. He stuffed rags in his ears until the whispering faded. The next morning, 4 sets of footprints were found beneath his window, leading back into the forest. Fear spread through the village like disease. Men who had once mocked the tales now carried crosses around their necks and carved protective symbols into their doors. Women burned sage and left bowls of salt on their windowsills. The priest prayed louder, his sermons turning darker, warning that evil had taken root in the land and that faith was their only defense. Yet even he admitted, in quiet moments, that prayer alone might not be enough. One night, a group of men decided to test their courage. They had been drinking at the tavern, trying to drown their fear, and as the fire crackled low, they dared one another to venture to the hollow house, the place where the sisters were said to dwell. Armed with lanterns and rifles, they marched into the forest, laughing too loudly, trying to convince themselves they were braver than they felt. The path was long, winding between gnarled trees that seemed to bend closer with every step. Eventually they reached the clearing. The hollow house loomed before them, more ruin than structure, its roof caved in, its walls leaning precariously. But what unsettled them most was the silence. No wind rustled the leaves, no insects chirped. Even the night birds were absent. One man swore the trees themselves seemed to lean away from the house, as though recoiling from whatever lived within. They circled the structure, their lanterns casting long shadows across the rotten wood. Symbols were carved into the beams, just as the villagers had said, strange spirals, jagged lines, unfamiliar runes that seemed to shift in the flickering light. One man dared to step inside. He later claimed the air was colder than winter inside. Those walls. His breath visible in the darkness, though outside it was spring. And then he heard it. Singing. Not loud, not close, but distant, echoing as though carried on the wind. 4 voices, soft and sweet, harmonizing in a language he did not recognize. He stumbled back, tripping over the threshold, and begged the others to leave. They laughed at him, saying it was just the wind, but as they turned to go, Their laughter faltered. 4 figures stood at the edge of the clearing. The lanterns flickered, and though the light was weak, the men swore the figures were unmistakable. 4 pale shapes standing in a line, unmoving, watching. The tallest swayed slightly, her limbs too long, her silhouette wrong against the trees. The smallest tilted her head, her face obscured. The man with the lantern dropped it in panic, plunging, the clearing into darkness. In that instant, chaos erupted. They fled, crashing through the underbrush, not daring to look back. Only 3 of them returned. The 4th, a man named Thomas Reed, was never seen again. His friends claimed he had tripped, that they tried to help him. But the moment they turned, he was gone. No sound, no scream, just gone. When they mustered the courage to return the next morning, there was no trace of him. The ground where he had fallen was undisturbed, the leaves uncrushed, the earth smooth as though he had never set foot there at all. The survivors swore to secrecy, but word spread quickly. The village knew then that the sisters were not content to remain in the forest. They came when called, when mocked, when sought out, and when they came, they took. From that night on, no one dared venture near the hollow house again. The path grew over with weeds, the clearing swallowed by the forest. But the memory remained. Mothers told their children the tale in hushed voices, warning them that if they ever heard singing in the woods, they must cover their ears and run. Fathers carved deeper marks into their doors, muttering prayers they barely remembered. But nothing could stop the feeling that grew in the village, the sense that the sisters were drawing closer each night. The air grew heavy, the woods louder, the shadows deeper. People claimed they saw 4 figures reflected in mirrors, though when they turned, no one was there. Others swore their dreams were no longer their own, that they woke with songs still, echoing in their ears, songs they should not have understood, but somehow did. By midsummer, fear had turned to despair. Entire families vanished without a trace, their homes left behind as though they had risen from the dinner table and simply walked out. No one heard them leave, no one saw them on the road, no one found them in the woods. The only clue was always the same, 4 faint footprints in the dirt, leading away from the house. And the whispers grew louder. Always 4 voices, always together, always calling. The villagers no longer asked if the sisters were real. The only question left was who would be taken next. The summer of 1845 settled heavy over the village, but instead of warmth bringing relief, it brought a suffocating dread. Days felt shorter, nights longer, and the air seemed thick with something unseen. People walked quickly, spoke little, and avoided the woods entirely, but the woods did not avoid them. It was as if the forest had begun to creep closer with each passing day. The tree line inching nearer to the edges of farmland, shadows stretching just a little further than they had the day before. The villagers noticed it, but refused to speak of it aloud, afraid that to name the change would be to give it power. At first, the signs were small. A farmer found all his sheep huddled in one corner of their pen, eyes wide, refusing to move. Another man discovered his well water sour, though no explanation could be found. Doors left unlocked were found open in the morning, though no one in the house remembered rising in the night. Children who should have been sleeping were discovered standing by their windows, staring into the darkness, eyes glazed as if listening to something far away. When shaken, they would gasp as though waking from a dream and insist they had only been asleep. Yet every parent knew better. The voices had reached inside the village. One woman, a widow named Eleanor, claimed she woke one night to hear her husband's voice calling her from outside. He had been dead for 2 years. She lay frozen in her bed as the voice begged her to open the door. It was warm, familiar, pleading. But when she glanced at the crack between the shutters, she saw 4 silhouettes standing in the moonlight, motionless, side by side. She clutched her cross to her chest and whispered prayers until dawn. By morning, the ground outside her home was marked with bare footprints, too many to count. She did not leave her bed for 3 days after, and when she finally emerged, her hair had gone grey. The priest tried to rally the villagers, insisting that faith would protect them, but even he looked hollow-eyed. He confessed quietly to a trusted friend that he had seen them himself, 4 shapes gliding through the graveyard behind the church. They did not walk so much as drift, their feet barely touching the ground. When he raised his lantern, the flame sputtered and nearly died, and though he shouted prayers into the night, the figures did not scatter. They only turned their heads in unison to look at him, and he fled before he could see more. The accounts grew stranger with each week. A young boy disappeared while playing hide-and-seek with his sister. She swore he had been hiding behind the barn, and she heard him whispering her name, but when she went to find him, he was gone. The barn door was open, and inside 4 sets of dusty footprints led up the wall itself, stopping at the rafters as though the figures had simply walked into the ceiling and vanished. The boy was never found. His sister never spoke again, and then there was the diary. A man named Jonathan Briggs, who had moved to the settlement only a year earlier, kept a careful journal of his days. After his disappearance, neighbors found the book beneath his pillow. The last entries were written in a shaky hand, each one more frantic than the last. He wrote of hearing women singing at his window, of feeling breath on his neck as he tried to sleep, of seeing faces reflected in water that were not his own. His final entry was the most disturbing. It read simply, "They are inside. I did not open the door. They are already inside." After that, the pages were blank. Some villagers believed the sisters could not be fought, that they were not human, not spirits, but something older, something the earth itself had birthed long before settlers came to Maine. The native people of the region, though rarely speaking of the forest, sometimes warned outsiders of women with no shadows who sang men to their deaths. But even these warnings were vague, fragmented, passed down in whispers rather than clear stories. When pressed, the elders refused to say more, shaking their heads and muttering prayers in their own tongue. Whatever the sisters were, no one wanted to speak of them too loudly. The strangest detail was always the number 4, never 3, never 5, always 4, and always together. Those who claimed to have seen them said they moved as one, turned their heads in unison, breathed in rhythm. If one smiled, they all smiled. If one tilted her head, the others followed. It was as though they were not separate beings at all, but one entity split into 4 shapes. Some said they were bound by blood, others that they shared a single soul, fractured into pieces. But no one dared to ask which explanation was worse. The fear drove the villagers to desperate measures. They hammered iron nails into doorframes, hung bells from windows, scattered salt across thresholds. Mothers tied red strings around their children's wrists, muttering charms learned from their grandmothers. Fathers carved crosses into the bark of trees around their farms, as though the marks might ward off whatever drifted through the woods. But none of it seemed to matter. The sisters came anyway, slipping past every barrier, ignoring every prayer. One evening, a family of 5 prepared to flee. They packed their wagon, loaded their children, and set off down the narrow dirt road that led away from the settlement. They were never seen again. Days later, their wagon was found overturned in a clearing miles away. The horse was gone. The belongings still sat in the wagon, untouched, as though no human hand had disturbed them. But all around the clearing, the ground was pressed with footprints, 4 repeated over and over, circling the wagon in endless loops. The family's bodies were never found. As the summer deepened, the villagers began to unravel. Trust broke down. Neighbors accused one another of drawing the sisters closer, of speaking with them, of making bargains in the night. One woman was driven from the settlement, after others swore she had been seen standing outside at midnight, talking softly to someone no one else could see. Another man was beaten when he admitted that the singing he heard sounded sweet to him, that he dreamed of it even when awake. Paranoia spread like wildfire. People locked their doors not only against the sisters, but against each other. And through it all, the hollow house stood silent in the woods, its roof sagging, its walls rotting, but its presence undeniable. No one dared to go near it, yet everyone felt its pull. Some claimed that if you listened closely on a still night, you could hear faint music drifting from that direction, as though the house itself exhaled the sisters' song. Others insisted. The forest grew thicker around it each year, trees pressing close like guardians keeping something imprisoned. But imprisoned or not, the sisters moved freely enough. There was one story that circulated, whispered from ear to ear, though no one ever admitted where it had come from. It told of a traveler passing through the village, a man unfamiliar with the tales. He was warned not to walk the woods at night, but being a skeptic, he ignored the warnings. He vanished, as many others had. But unlike the others, his body was found. It lay at the edge of the river, eyes wide, mouth frozen in a scream. His hands were torn as though he had clawed at his own face. But the most disturbing detail was that his body bore 4 sets of bruises, each in the shape of a hand, pressed deep into his skin. By late August, the villagers lived in near silence. No one lingered outside after dark. No one went near the trees. The sound of singing, once rare, had become constant. It rose in the evenings like a chorus, drifting through the air, sometimes near, sometimes far, but always present. It seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. People described it as beautiful and unbearable all at once. The kind of sound that made your chest ache, the kind that pulled at your soul, begging you to follow. And those who followed never returned. The settlement was dying, and everyone knew it. Yet still, the outside world paid no attention. No newspapers reported the vanishings, no scientists studied the events. It was as though the village had been cut out of reality itself, sealed away in silence while the rest of the world marched forward. The few travelers who stumbled through rarely stayed, and those who did left quickly, their faces pale, their voices hushed. They spoke of unease, of feeling watched, of waking in the night to 4 shadows standing by their bed. The story of the sisters was no longer a tale to frighten children. It was the truth of the village, the reason the settlement dwindled, the reason families fled in the night. But for those who remained, there was no escape. The sisters had woven themselves into the very fabric of their lives. Every creak of wood, every rustle of leaves, every whisper of wind might be them. And as autumn approached, the villagers began to realize something more terrible than they had ever feared. The sisters were not simply haunting the woods. They were coming closer, pressing in on the village itself. And soon there would be nowhere left to run. Autumn crept into the village quietly, though no one welcomed it. The air grew sharper, the leaves turned brittle underfoot, and the nights stretched longer. What should have been a season of harvest and celebration was instead filled with fear, because the villagers knew that with every shortening day, the sisters would grow stronger. Darkness was their hour, and darkness was winning. The crops that year were poor. Corn withered too early, wheat rotted in the damp, and even the apples from the orchards carried a bitter taste. People whispered that the soil itself had been poisoned, not by weather, not by pests, but by the presence that lingered in the woods. The sisters did not simply haunt the people, they haunted the land. The animals sensed it too. Chickens refused to lay eggs, cows gave sour milk, and hunters returned empty-handed. Some said the deer had vanished entirely, fleeing the forest. Others swore the deer were still there but stood still in the trees, watching, eyes reflecting. Lantern light though they never moved, the disappearances did not stop. In fact, they grew more frequent. By October, nearly every family had lost someone. Brothers, wives, daughters, sons, taken without warning, without a trace. The rules that once gave comfort no longer seemed to matter. Doors bolted tight still, swung open in the night. Children who slept with crosses under their pillows still vanished from their beds. No matter what the villagers did, the sisters took who they pleased. One family was found gone in a single night, their home left in perfect order. Food sat half-eaten on the table, a candle still burned low, but the parents and 3 children had vanished as if they had stood up in unison and walked away. Only the floor bore any sign of what had happened. 4 trails of footprints circling the room, weaving between the chairs, looping around the table, as if the sisters had danced inside before leading the family away. The priest, Father Andrew, grew more desperate. His sermons turned frantic, his prayers louder, his voice hoarse from begging God to intervene. He began fasting, refusing to eat, claiming that only purity would protect him. Some villagers found him kneeling in the graveyard one night, eyes rolled back, muttering in tongues none of them recognized. When asked what he was saying, he wept and refused to answer. The next morning, symbols were found carved into the stones of the oldest graves. Circles, spirals, lines like those etched into the beams of the hollow house. No one admitted to carving them, and Father Andrew swore he did not, yet the knife he carried was stained with fresh splinters. The singing grew, louder with each week. At first it had been faint, drifting from the woods. Now it seemed to rise from beneath the ground itself, vibrating through the floorboards of homes, rattling glass panes, echoing in the bones of those who heard it. People covered their ears, but the sound pressed deeper, not just heard but felt. Mothers rocked their children to sleep as tears streamed down their cheeks, because even lullabies could not drown out the voices of the sisters. There were those who tried to fight back. A group of young men gathered one night with rifles, lanterns, and hounds, swearing they would end the terror once and for all. They marched into the woods, their courage bolstered by drink and desperation. The hounds barked furiously, straining against their leashes until suddenly they fell silent. The men pushed deeper, following the trail to the hollow house. No one saw them again. Days later, the hounds returned alone. Their fur was matted, their eyes wide, and their bodies trembling as though beaten. They refused to step inside the village again, snarling whenever dragged near. The men were never found. The village began to empty. Wagons rolled away in the dead of night, families abandoning their homes and land, leaving behind only silence. But those who left were not always safe. A family who had fled east was later found by travelers days from the settlement. Their wagon stood abandoned on the roadside, goods still neatly packed, horse-tethered and alive. But the family was gone. Their belongings were untouched, but 4 faint trails of footprints circled the wagon, pressed deep into the mud. By November, fewer than half the original villagers remained. Those who stayed did not stay out of courage, but out of fear that leaving would only bring the sisters closer. Better to endure, they reasoned, than to risk drawing their attention beyond the woods. But endurance came at a price. Food ran low, faith faltered, and whispers filled the air. Some claimed to see the sisters in broad daylight now, standing at the far edge of fields, motionless, waiting. Others said they no longer needed to wait at all, that the sisters had begun to appear inside homes without doors opening, without windows creaking. Shadows stretched unnaturally in corners, voices sang from the walls themselves, and reflections in mirrors showed 4 figures standing behind those who looked. One chilling account came from a woman named Ruth. She awoke in the middle of the night to the sound of someone breathing beside her bed. At first, she thought it was her husband, but when she turned, he was gone. In his place stood 4 figures, pale and silent. She could not move, could not scream, as they leaned closer, their faces almost touching hers. She shut her eyes and prayed until she lost consciousness. In the morning, she was alive, but her husband was never seen again. The bed beside her was cold, the pillow indented as though someone had lain there, but the blankets undisturbed. The fear drove some to madness. A man was found wandering the woods naked, muttering about songs that would not stop. When pressed, he claimed the sisters had shown him visions of a world without pain, a place where the dead still walked and sang forever. His eyes were wide, unblinking, and when the priest tried to bless him, he screamed until his voice broke. Days later, he hanged himself from a tree on the edge of the forest. Carved into the bark beneath his feet were 4 symbols no one recognized. The hollow house grew more sinister as the season deepened. Strange lights flickered within at night, glowing faintly like lanterns, though no one dared approach. Some claimed to see shadows moving in the broken windows, 4 at a time, swaying as if to music. Others swore they heard laughter drifting from its walls, the laughter of young girls, though twisted, mocking, hollow. The forest itself seemed to bend around the place, trees leaning like bowed sentinels, and though no one entered, the house seemed less abandoned with each passing day, as though something within was rebuilding it piece by piece. As the first snow fell, despair settled fully over the remaining villagers. The roads would soon be impassable, trapping them for the winter. Those who remained huddled in their homes, speaking little, avoiding the woods and praying they might see spring. Yet even in their silence, the sisters came, 4 shadows passing across shuttered windows, 4 sets of footsteps crunching in the snow outside doors, 4 voices singing lullabies no one wanted to hear. What terrified them most was the realization that the sisters no longer needed to wait for nightfall. They had once been creatures of darkness, bound to the woods, to moonlight and shadow. But now they lingered in the daylight too. Farmers tending their animals claimed to see 4 figures, standing in the far field, perfectly still, even under the noonday sun. Children playing indoors sometimes pointed to the corners of the room and whispered, "They're here." The villagers stopped asking if they would survive the winter. Instead, they asked how many of them would remain when the thaw came again, and somewhere deep within the woods, the sisters sang louder than ever. The first true blizzard arrived without warning. Snow fell thick and heavy, blanketing the village in silence. Roads vanished, rooftops sagged under the weight, and chimneys coughed smoke into the howling wind. It should have been a season of gathering close, of firelight and comfort. But instead, the snow only deepened the villagers' fear. The world felt smaller now, cut off by white walls and biting cold, with no escape from what haunted them. Inside their homes, families tried to shut out the storm, yet the sisters' presence slipped through cracks no frost could seal. In the hush between the roar of the wind, villagers heard it, their song steady, clear, as if carried on the storm itself. The notes drifted in circles, never fading, never ending, weaving through the shriek of the blizzard like a secret voice, meant only for those trapped inside. Children cried at night, begging their parents to make it stop. Parents told them to cover their ears, to pray, to think of warm places and brighter days. But the song always returned, slipping into dreams, tugging sleepers toward windows where 4 pale figures sometimes stood beyond the frost, watching with patient eyes. The footprints in the snow confirmed it. Always 4, circling houses, pressing deep into drifts, sometimes stopping directly at the doors. The blizzard lasted 3 days, and when it finally broke, the village discovered another family gone. The Millers had lived on the far edge, in a sturdy house warmed by a great stone hearth. When the storm passed, neighbors trudged through the drifts to check on them, but what they found made even the bravest retreat. The Millers' home was silent, their fire long dead. Inside, the furniture was neatly arranged, food left uneaten on the table. No bodies, no signs of struggle. Only one thing was different. In the middle of the floor, carved into the wood itself, was a perfect circle surrounded by 4 interlocking symbols. Snow blew in through the open door, settling into the grooves, as if to remind the village that the sisters had been there, even while the storm raged. From that moment, hope began to rot. The villagers had once believed that storms and prayers and locked doors could keep the sisters away, but the Millers' disappearance proved otherwise. Some argued the only solution was to destroy the hollow house, to burn it to ash, to cut the heart out of the curse. But others whispered that fire would only anger them more, that their grip would tighten if challenged. The village was divided, yet too afraid to act either way. Father Andrew tried again to rally them. He stood in the chapel, his voice echoing in the hollow space as he preached of endurance and faith. He called the sisters demons, tempters sent to test their devotion, and begged his flock to resist. But his words no longer carried strength. He had grown gaunt, his eyes hollow, his hands trembling. People looked at him and saw not a leader but a man unraveling. Some claimed they heard him muttering the sisters' song under his breath when he thought no one was listening. The hollow house, meanwhile, seemed alive. Smoke sometimes curled from its broken chimney, though no fire should have burned inside. Lantern glow flickered in shattered windows, faint but undeniable. A group of villagers swore they saw figures moving within, 4 shadows pacing in unison, sometimes swaying as though in a dance. The forest around the house grew unnaturally still, trees coated in frost that did not melt even when touched by sunlight. Travelers who passed too close said they felt watched, as though the house itself had eyes. And then came the night of the first thaw. Winter should have tightened its grip, but a sudden warm wind blew through, melting snow into black mud. That night, the villagers were woken by a sound far worse than singing. Laughter. Not childish, not innocent, but sharp and hollow, spilling through the village like smoke. It echoed from walls, from the ground, from the air itself, until people clutched their ears and wept. Horses broke free from their stables and bolted. Dogs howled until their voices cracked. By morning, 2 more were gone. A pair of brothers who had lived together in a cabin by the creek. Their beds were empty, the door wide open. Only their boots remained, neatly placed side by side at the threshold. In the mud outside, 4 sets of prints circled again, overlapping, in strange patterns, as though the sisters had danced in delight after taking them. The disappearances broke something in the villagers. They no longer spoke of fighting back, nor of fleeing. They moved through their days like shadows themselves, voices low, eyes downcast. They began leaving offerings at the edges of the forest, bread, milk, even trinkets from their homes, as though appeasement might save them. But the offerings always vanished, and still the sisters came. One evening, Ruth, the woman who had once awoken to find her husband gone, confessed a terrible dream. She said she had seen the sisters standing over the village, hands outstretched, pulling invisible strings tied to each house. When she woke, she found faint marks on her arms, red and raw, as though strings had pressed into her skin. She swore the sisters had been touching her even in sleep. No one doubted her, for the bruises were real. By now, fewer than 20 villagers remained. Entire streets stood empty, houses abandoned or filled with silence too heavy to enter. Snow crept in through broken shutters. The graveyard grew crowded, not only with the buried, but with names carved into stones for those who had vanished, bodies never found. Each stone bore a small circle etched at its base, a desperate attempt to ward off what could not be stopped. Then came the night when the sisters stepped fully into the village. It was Ruth who saw them first, standing in the square beneath the moonlight. 4 women, pale as frost, hair dark and heavy, eyes reflecting like mirrors. They did not speak, did not move, but stood in perfect formation, facing the chapel. Ruth screamed, and when others looked, they saw them too. Doors slammed, shutters closed, but everyone knew. The sisters had crossed a boundary that could never be restored. For hours they remained, unmoving, watching. At one point, their voices rose together in song, louder than ever, so piercing it rattled glass. Lamps shattered, livestock broke free, and several villagers collapsed with blood trickling from their ears. Then, as suddenly as they had appeared, the sisters turned and walked toward the woods. Their footprints, 4 neat trails, remained pressed deep into the earth long after dawn. The message was clear. The sisters no longer needed to wait outside. They had claimed the village as their own. From then on, no one slept peacefully. Shadows stretched too long across the floorboards. Reflections showed 4 figures where only one should have been. Even in daylight, laughter sometimes bubbled from nowhere, curling in alleys and echoing through chimneys. Food spoiled faster, fires guttered for no reason, and the air itself seemed to weigh heavier. The village was dying, not from hunger or cold, but from something unseen, something that pressed down like a hand around its throat. And still, the hollow house pulsed with light and sound, a beacon in the woods. It was no longer abandoned, it was alive, throbbing with presence. Those brave enough to look swore they saw not 4 shadows within, but many, dozens, perhaps hundreds, moving in rhythm to a song no human throat should produce. The sisters, it seemed, were no longer alone. The survivors whispered to each other in fear. Were the vanished truly gone? Or had they become part of that house, part of that endless song? No one dared speak the question aloud, but the answer lurked in every silence. The village was no longer simply haunted, it was being consumed. The winter deepened, though the calendar insisted spring was not far away. No thaw returned. No gentle sun rose to soften the frozen land. Instead, the cold pressed harder, relentless, as though the season itself had been claimed by the sisters. Snow no longer fell in soft flakes. It came in sheets, sharp as glass, slicing against skin and piling into drifts taller than men. Trees bowed beneath the weight, their limbs snapping in mournful cracks that echoed across the valley. The sky rarely brightened beyond a steel gray, and the moon, when it showed, hung too large and too close, painting the world in a pale, unnatural glow. The few remaining villagers felt trapped in a place that no longer belonged to them. They moved slowly, huddled in cloaks, speaking little. Every footstep seemed to echo. Doors were barred tighter, windows covered with boards and cloth, but none of it kept the sisters away. Their song now drifted through the cracks of even the most fortified homes. At first, people tried to drown it out with prayers or by hammering pans together, but over time, they stopped resisting. The song was no longer just sound, it was inside them, curling through veins and bones, a melody that refused to be silenced. Some began humming it unconsciously, mouths moving in rhythm, even as their eyes filled with terror at what they were doing. Others awoke in the night to find themselves standing barefoot outside in the snow, having sleepwalked to the village square, their lips still mouthing the words. They would be pulled back inside by trembling neighbors, but each time it happened, a little more strength drained from them. It was as if the sisters were practicing, pulling strings tighter, testing their control. The hollow house glowed brighter now, a constant beacon beyond the skeletal trees. No one dared approach, but all could see it. At night, the light shifted. Colors, blue, green, red, washing over the snow as though the house pulsed with some living heart. Shadows crossed the windows, more than 4, always moving in patterns too exact to be chance. Sometimes the shutters banged open, and a wave of song spilled out, so loud and pure it rattled the teeth of anyone nearby. On those nights, people swore the stars themselves seemed to dim. The village graveyard told its own story. Where once the names of the lost had been marked with circles scratched into stone, now the circles had begun to change. Without human hands touching them, the carvings deepened, warped, connecting into new shapes, interwoven rings that spiraled inward. Snow refused to gather on those graves, leaving them bare and dark against the white earth. A farmer, one of the last who still ventured near, claimed he saw 4 figures kneeling among the stones, their heads bowed in what looked like prayer. When he blinked, they were gone, but every grave bore fresh markings afterward. He refused to return, and not long after, he disappeared entirely. By this time, fewer than a dozen souls remained. Their eyes were sunken, their cheeks hollow, their voices hoarse from silence. They clung to one another in the chapel, too afraid to be alone. The building itself had become their last refuge, though even there the air carried a heaviness, the sense that unseen hands brushed against their shoulders when no one else stood near. Father Andrew still attempted his sermons, though his voice cracked and shook, and more often than not, he trailed off into whispers. Once, as the villagers sat, huddled before him, he began to sing, not a hymn but the sisters' melody, word for word. His hands trembled as he clutched the altar, and when the others cried out for him to stop, he collapsed, unconscious, his lips still forming the refrain. From that night on, no one trusted him. They let him sit among them, but always watched, always wary, as though at any moment he might stand and lead them all to the hollow house. He aged quickly in those days, his skin sagging, his eyes hollowing, as though the song consumed him from within. Some whispered he had been chosen as their mouthpiece, their herald, but no one dared to say it aloud in his presence. The sisters, meanwhile, grew bolder. They were no longer content to circle the village unseen. More and more often, they appeared, within its boundaries, at wells, in alleys, even on doorsteps. Always 4, always silent, watching with eyes that reflected light where none should exist. On one moonlit night, a boy, the last child left alive, looked out his window and saw them standing in the square again. This time they were not facing the chapel. They were facing his home. By morning, he and his parents were gone, their house standing open to the snow. Inside, the walls were covered in frost, and at the center of the floor was a new circle, carved with symbols more intricate than ever. The few survivors no longer dared to leave offerings. They understood now that the sisters wanted no gifts, no bargains. They wanted only one thing, to draw the living into their endless company. It was not hunger or revenge, it was expansion. The sisters were building something greater, and the hollow house was its heart. And then, one night, the house spoke. Not in words, not in song, but in a sound so deep it seemed to vibrate through the ground itself. The village shook as though, from an earthquake, snow sliding from rooftops, icicles shattering like glass. Animals screamed and fled into the woods. The light from the hollow house flared until it seemed the forest itself was on fire, yet no heat touched the air. The sound built higher and higher until every villager collapsed to their knees, clutching their heads, blood dripping from noses and ears. And then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. Silence fell. When they dared look up, 4 figures stood at the chapel door. They did not enter. They only stood, watching, their faces blank and their eyes glinting. For the first time, the survivors saw their features clearly. They were not monstrous, not deformed, but beautiful, too beautiful in the way of something carved from ice or stone, flawless but lifeless. Their lips parted, and for the first time, words came instead of song. "You belong to us." Only that. Soft, certain, final. Then they turned and vanished into the snow, leaving behind a silence more terrifying than any sound. The survivors did not sleep that night, nor the next. They gathered together, trembling, whispering plans they had no strength to carry out. Some spoke of fire again, of storming the hollow house and ending it all, but none dared take the first step. Others argued they should leave, abandon the village to its fate, and flee into the mountains. But the thought of the sisters waiting in the trees, of hearing that song following them wherever they went, silenced those ideas as well. They were trapped, not by walls, but by fear that the world beyond was no safer than the prison they already knew. It was Ruth, hollow-eyed and shaking, who finally broke the silence. She said she had dreamed again, of the sisters standing at the altar, of the chapel, their hands raised, drawing strings from the rafters like puppet threads. In her dream, every villager had stood below, arms lifted helplessly, their mouths open in song. She said it felt less like a dream and more like a warning or a promise. No one laughed at her. No one doubted her. They only sat in silence, staring at the altar, waiting for the day when the dream would become reality. The days bled together after that, one long night without end. The song never ceased, the footprints never faded, and the hollow house pulsed with life, growing stronger, brighter, as though feeding on the village itself. Those who still clung to sanity knew, with a certainty as cold as the snow, that the end was drawing near. Not an end of death, but of transformation, of being pulled into something from which there would be no return. The final days arrived quietly, without announcement, without any great catastrophe. They slipped in like shadows at dusk, unnoticed until they had already surrounded the village. Snow no longer fell, yet the ground grew whiter, brighter, as if the earth itself was turning to frost. No footprints remained, not even those of the sisters. It was as though the land had stopped acknowledging the presence of the living. The chapel doors groaned under the strain of constant wind, though the air outside was perfectly still. The candles within had begun to sputter and die faster than they could be replaced, their wax dripping down into twisted, unnatural shapes. Every time one flame went out, the song rose louder, pressing harder against the walls, as though mocking the effort to keep the darkness at bay. Those who remained sat together in silence. There were only 5 of them now: Ruth, Father Andrew, the blacksmith Elias, an old widow named Mara, and a hunter called Joel. Their faces were pale, their eyes sunken, their hands trembling even when they tried to keep them still. They did not eat. They did not sleep. They listened. That was all they could do. It was Joel who first spoke of ending it. His voice cracked, but his words were steady. He said they had only 2 choices left: to wait for the sisters to claim them one by one, or to step into the hollow house themselves and face whatever truth awaited there. He said perhaps the sisters wanted them to come willingly, that perhaps this had been the point all along. Mara hissed at him to be silent, to not even think of such a thing, but her hands twisted in her lap as though she already knew he was right. Father Andrew said nothing for a long time. He only stared at the altar, his lips moving in silent prayer, or silent song. None of them could be sure anymore. When he finally spoke, his voice was weary, resigned. He said the house had been waiting for them, calling them, shaping everything to lead them there. He said it would not matter if they resisted. In the end, they would be taken anyway. Better to walk than to be dragged. Ruth began to cry then, not out of fear but out of exhaustion, the kind of crying that made no sound, only left her shoulders shaking. She said she had seen it again in her dreams. The sisters at the altar, the strings of light, the villagers below, and the hollow house glowing like a star above them all. She said she could no longer tell if it was a vision of the future or if she had already lived it and was only remembering. In the silence that followed, Elias rose to his feet. He was a large man once, strong, but now he looked thin and broken, his shoulders hunched, his hands trembling. Still, he picked up the iron poker that lay near the fire and held it like a weapon. He said nothing, only nodded toward the door. The others did not argue. They did not try to stop him. One by one, they followed. The village was empty as they stepped into the snow. The houses stood dark and silent, their doors swinging open, their windows frosted over. The square was barren, the well half buried in ice. Yet the song was everywhere, vibrating through the air, pulsing beneath their feet. It was no longer something heard with the ears, it was something felt in the bones, in the blood. It pushed them forward like a tide. The hollow house burned in the distance, brighter than ever before. Its walls shimmered as though made of glass, its windows pulsed with shifting light. The path toward it seemed shorter than it ever had, though none of them could remember walking it before. They only knew, with a certainty that gnawed at their hearts, that this was where they had always been meant to go. When they reached the edge of the clearing, the air grew heavier, colder though. Their breath no longer showed in the frost. The house loomed before them, taller now, its angles sharper, its presence unbearable. The door stood open, spilling out a light that was neither warm nor cold, but something beyond both, something that burned without heat. They paused there, standing at the threshold, their bodies trembling. No words were spoken, none were needed. Slowly, as though drawn by invisible hands, they stepped inside. The air within was thick, almost liquid, each breath heavy in their lungs. The walls shimmered, shifting between wood, stone, and something, translucent, as though the house could not decide what it was made of. The floor pulsed faintly beneath their feet, like the rhythm of a heartbeat. Shadows stretched across the walls, but none of them belonged to the five who had entered. At the center of the room stood the sisters, 4 of them arranged in a circle, their hands clasped, their heads bowed. Their skin glowed faintly, their eyes shut, their mouths curved in the faintest of smiles. The song came from them now, not from the air, rising and falling in harmonies that twisted into patterns too complex to follow. The villagers froze, too terrified to move, too entranced to turn away. The sisters lifted their heads in unison, their eyes opening. Light poured from them, filling the room, wrapping around the 5 like threads. The villagers tried to scream, but no sound came. Their jaws moved, their throats strained, but only the sisters' melody emerged. The song took hold, their bodies bent against their will, their arms lifting, their legs moving, pulling them into the circle. Elias dropped his iron poker, his hands opening as if in worship. Mara's eyes rolled back, her lips parting in silent surrender. Ruth's tears froze on her cheeks as she stepped forward, her feet moving to a rhythm not her own. Father Andrew did not resist at all. He sang with them, his voice blending seamlessly into their chorus. Joel alone fought. His body jerked, his teeth clenched, his eyes wild. He stumbled backward, clawing at the air as if to rip the threads from his skin. But the more he fought, the tighter they bound him. His mouth opened against his will, and the song poured out raw and perfect, as though it had always belonged to him. The sisters smiled then, truly smiled, for the first time. They opened their arms, and the villagers stepped into their embrace. The circle closed. The house shook, its walls bending inward, its floor splitting to reveal a vast darkness below. Light poured upward, strings of brilliance that connected, each body weaving them together until no one could tell where one ended and another began. The five screamed, but the screams were only more music, notes in the endless refrain. Their bodies dissolved into light, their faces melting into the glow, their names, their memories, their very selves unraveled, drawn into the sisters' song. And then there were not five. There were 9. The circle widened, the house pulsed, brighter. The song grew stronger, reaching out beyond the walls, beyond the trees, beyond the mountains. It spread across the land, a tide that could not be resisted, and still the sisters sang. The song did not end when the circle closed. It did not fade with the village's dissolution into light. Instead, it swelled, vast and uncontainable, pressing against the walls of the hollow house until they shattered into brilliance. Where once there had been timber and glass, there was now only radiance, a living pulse of sound and light that rose like a beacon into the night sky. Those who had once lived in the village were no longer bodies, no longer faces or names. They were threads woven into the sisters' chorus, their voices carried endlessly, harmonizing without pause. The melody slipped into the ground, seeped into the water, drifted across the frozen air. It rode the wind, invisible but undeniable, and wherever it touched, silence followed. Miles away, in another town that had never heard of the hollow house, dogs began to howl without reason. They trembled, pressed themselves against the earth, and whined as though their ears were being pierced by something too high, too sharp. Horses reared, stamping at nothing, their eyes rolling white with terror. Children woke screaming from dreams they could not describe. The adults listened. They heard nothing at first, only the soft sigh of wind, the crackle of fire in their hearths. But then, just faintly like a whisper, they began to sense it. A low hum vibrating at the edge of hearing, so soft it might have been mistaken for their own pulse. Yet it did not stop. It did not change. And once heard, it could not be unheard. At sea, sailors spoke of it as a phantom current. They said their ships seemed to sway with no wind, their compasses twitching as if confused. One sailor swore he had heard voices rising from the waves themselves, voices of women calling in tones both sweet and unbearable. He stuffed cotton into his ears, but still he felt it in his chest, each beat of his heart sinking with the rhythm until he thought it might burst. When he returned to shore, he abandoned the sea altogether, claiming no human vessel could withstand what now lingered in the waters. Scholars far away in Boston and New York found themselves waking at odd hours, ink spilled across pages where their hands had trembled without reason. They reported strange dreams, visions of white light and endless circles, of strings stretched across the sky like a vast instrument being plucked by invisible fingers. They described hearing music when none was playing, melodies layered so intricately their minds could not follow. Some laughed it off, blaming fatigue, stress, or illness. Others fell silent, unable to speak of what they had seen for fear of being thought mad. But the song grew stronger. A farmer in Vermont stopped in his field one afternoon, his scythe slipping from his hands as he stood frozen, listening to nothing. His wife found him hours later, still staring at the horizon, his lips moving as though singing a hymn she could not hear. When she touched his arm, he turned to her with a vacant smile, and his voice rose, soft, beautiful, inhuman. She fled before he could finish the verse. In Maine's coastal towns, fishermen refused to sail, claiming the tides no longer moved as they should. They spoke of seeing lights beneath the water, flickering like stars trapped in the depths. Some said the lights followed them home, appearing in their dreams, whispering promises of peace if only they would surrender to the current. A few never woke again, their bodies found with expressions of bliss, their mouths curved in a half-formed song. By spring, the phenomenon had spread farther still. Reports trickled in from across New England. Strange lights in the woods, voices carried on the wind, entire families found missing from their homes. Always the same, always without struggle, as though they had simply stood up and walked away, following a melody no one else could hear. Priests called it a test of faith. Scientists scoffed, insisting it was mass hysteria. Doctors blamed a fever, a madness brought on by isolation or hunger. Yet none could explain the sheer consistency of the accounts, nor the way animals, machines, and even the land itself seemed to respond. Earth cracked where no frost should have reached. Rivers froze solid in patterns that mirrored the strange strings of light Ruth had once described. Bells in churches rang without being touched, their tones echoing faintly in time with the unseen song. And always at the center, there were whispers of the Hollow House. Though the village itself was said to be gone, erased as though it had never existed, travelers swore they found remnants. Stones scattered in perfect circles, trees bent inward as if bowing toward a vanished core. Some claimed they saw it still standing, glowing faintly in the distance, only to vanish when approached. Others told of hearing voices urging them closer, guiding their steps until terror forced them to turn back. No map recorded the village. No document bore its name. Yet everyone who heard the whispers felt they already knew the place, as though it had been there all along, waiting. The sisters themselves had become legend. Their names were spoken cautiously, half in fear, half in reverence. Some called them saints, believing their song was divine, a gateway to heaven hidden on earth. Others swore they were demons, harbingers of an age when mankind would no longer rule its own fate. A few dared to suggest they were something else, entirely, neither holy nor damned, but ancient, belonging to a time before names, before history, when the world itself sang. But legends cannot be contained. The more people denied them, the more the song spread. Travelers brought it westward, their voices carrying faint strains they did not realize they were humming. Letters written by trembling hands bore patterns of words that matched the rhythm, though the writers swore they had no memory of composing them. Whole congregations began singing hymns they had never been taught, their melodies eerily uniform despite vast distances between them. And in every city, every town, there were those who disappeared. They left their homes unlocked, their meals half-eaten, their candles burning down to nothing. Some left notes, scrawled in shaky handwriting. I must go where the light leads. The Hollow House had become more than a place. It was a presence, a pulse, an inevitability. By the summer of 1846, newspapers could no longer ignore it. Articles spoke of the main affliction, describing entire communities where half the population had vanished overnight. Editors dismissed it as superstition, yet they printed the accounts anyway, for the stories sold more copies than politics or war. Some writers dared to hint at a pattern, that the disappearances always aligned with nights when the aurora danced, unusually bright, though even that could not explain the accompanying voices heard by so many. Governments took notice. Quietly, without public announcement, groups of men were dispatched to investigate. They returned, shaken, silent, their reports sealed away, locked in archives never meant to be opened. A few did not return at all. Those who survived spoke only once, in whispers, of a sound that had followed them for miles, echoing in their skulls long after they had left the forest. One man shot himself rather than describe what he had heard. Still, the sisters sang. The song no longer belonged to Maine, it belonged to the world, and though few realized it, every note carried a promise that what had begun in that quiet village, in that hollow house of shifting walls and impossible light, would not stop. It could not stop. The sisters were patient, the sisters were eternal, the song was only just beginning. The song had crossed oceans. No one could say when it happened, only that by the winter of 1847, reports from across the Atlantic echoed those that had first plagued New England. In small fishing villages along the coasts of Ireland and Scotland, men swore they heard voices rising from the waves at night. Women sitting by their hearths claimed to feel vibrations in the stone walls, a faint hum that grew louder when the wind blew eastward. Children began singing tunes their parents had never taught them, melodies that matched the rhythms carried across the sea. At first, these tales were dismissed as stories of sailors too long at sea, their minds softened by drink and salt air. But when entire communities in the Hebrides vanished without trace, doors swinging on their hinges, livestock untended, food left to rot, officials could not laugh it off. Those who investigated reported strange patterns carved into the sand, circles and spirals pressed deep as though etched by a hand larger than any human. They spoke of lights beneath the water, the same shifting glow once described in Maine, drifting like lanterns but too steady, too purposeful to be natural. By spring, the phenomenon had spread further inland. In Germany, peasants reported hearing music drifting through the Black Forest, music so sweet it made them drop their tools and wander without thought. In France, entire monasteries wrote of sudden visions, choirs of women in white, their eyes closed, their mouths open in endless song. The monks transcribed what they heard, but the notes made no sense. The patterns twisting in on themselves, impossible to replicate on any known scale. Some claimed it was a plague, though no sickness marked the bodies. Others said it was the devil's work, a temptation drawing humanity away from salvation. But wherever the song appeared, people followed. They left their villages, their farms, their families, drifting into woods, into rivers, into the unknown. And when they returned, if they returned at all, they came back altered, smiling too wide, humming tunes that made even the strongest men weep. Governments grew anxious. In London, the matter was debated behind closed doors. Officials whispered of Maine, of the hollow house that no longer stood but whose influence had not ended. Reports gathered dust in locked cabinets, sealed under wax and threat of treason. Soldiers sent to investigate never spoke of what they found. Some deserted their posts entirely, vanishing as if swallowed by the very thing they were sent to destroy. In Russia, stories spread of soldiers hearing choirs drifting across frozen plains, notes so sharp they shattered glass and split ice. Garrison posted near the Urals reported that their horses refused to move, trembling at sounds no man could hear. Days later, half the unit was gone, their rifles left in the snow. Only a single letter remained, scrawled in broken Cyrillic. "We walk toward the light. Do not follow." But people did follow. Always they followed. The church tried to contain it. Priests warned of heresy, of false angels. They performed exorcisms in villages, doused homes with holy water, rang bells in defiance of the unseen melody. Yet the bells themselves betrayed them, their tones bending, shifting until they matched the strange rhythm in the air. Choirs who sang to drown it out soon found their voices aligning with the hidden harmony, their hymns dissolving into something older, something nameless. Science fared no better. Men of learning carried instruments into the affected regions, hoping to measure, to record. But their machines faltered. Compass needles spun aimlessly. Pendulums froze mid-swing, glass tubes shattered under invisible pressure. Those who stayed, too long reported ringing in their skulls, headaches that bloomed into visions, white light, endless circles, women with eyes like hollow stars. They filled journals with sketches of patterns they did not understand, notes they could not decipher, before abandoning their work entirely. Ships were the next to suffer. In the Mediterranean, entire fleets reported hearing voices beneath the water, melodies rising like sirens from the deep. Captains lashed their men to the masts to prevent them from diving overboard, but the song seeped through the wood, through the ropes, through the very bones of the vessel. Sailors wept openly, begging to be released, promising they would return with treasures beyond imagining if only they were allowed to follow the call. When denied, some bit through their own tongues, choosing silence over restraint. By the late 1840s, whispers of the phenomenon had reached every corner of the globe. In India, villagers spoke of hearing music in the monsoon rains, voices carried in each drop. In Africa, traders swore that drums in the night began beating to rhythms no man had played. In China, fishermen reported that the rivers no longer flowed as before, the currents pulsing as if in time with a song beneath the earth. And in the Americas, far from Maine, travelers in Mexico and Brazil told of glowing circles appearing in the forests, vanishing the moment they were touched. It was no longer contained, no longer regional. It was everywhere, yet no one could find its source. The hollow house was gone, its village erased from maps and memory, and yet the influence persisted. Scholars argued that such a thing was impossible, that sound could not cross oceans, that visions could not appear in men of different languages and faiths with such precision. But still, the reports mounted. Still, the disappearances grew. Some began to say it was not sound at all, not in the way humans understood it. That what people heard was only the smallest fragment of something far larger, a resonance woven into the very fabric of the world. The sisters, they said, had not been destroyed. They had only been revealed. Their song had never been confined to Maine. It had been there all along, patient, hidden, waiting for a voice to draw it out. And so it spread, through forests and mountains, across oceans and deserts, threading its way into every corner of the earth. It slipped into dreams, into memory, into the spaces between thoughts. It hummed in the bones of the living and whispered in the silence of the dead. It asked nothing, demanded nothing, yet it took everything. For once the song was heard, it could not be forgotten, and once it was followed, there was no return. The hollow house was gone, the sisters unseen, but their presence, their melody, their promise, those were eternal, and the world, though it did not yet realize it, was already singing along. The century drew to a close, yet the song never faded. It drifted like smoke through the years, subtle but relentless, weaving itself into history's quiet corners. Wars came and went, empires rose and fell, and still the melody lingered. Never loud enough to be undeniable, never quiet enough to be forgotten. It became the hidden hum of the world, audible only to those who strayed too close to silence. By 1855, the last of the original witnesses from Maine had passed away, their names lost in census records, their stories reduced to rumor. But their children carried shadows in their eyes, and their grandchildren dreamed of oceans filled with light. Even far removed from that place and time, the memory endured like a bloodline curse, unspoken, but never absent. There were those who tried to banish it. Secret societies rose in Europe, their members sworn to contain the spread. They burned manuscripts that hinted at the tune, destroyed instruments suspected of capturing its notes, and silenced those who claimed to have heard it. They called themselves guardians, protectors of reason. But in time they too began to falter. For it is one thing to fight an enemy seen, and another to resist one that lives inside the air, the water, the marrow of one's bones. One by one, the guardians broke their vows. Some disappeared into forests, others walked into rivers and never surfaced. A few were found sitting in candle-lit rooms, humming softly as though rehearsing for a concert only they could attend. Science advanced, but with it came no answers. Devices became more sophisticated, yet the song remained elusive. It never registered on phonographs or early recorders, never bent itself to the will of machines. And yet scientists still heard it. While working late in their laboratories, while gazing into telescopes, while charting the strange rhythms of stars. Some abandoned their studies altogether, claiming they had glimpsed a symmetry too vast, a harmony too perfect to belong to chance. They left behind sketches of spirals, maps of constellations linked by unseen threads, equations that looped endlessly without conclusion. But perhaps the most unsettling were the testimonies from those who had followed it and returned, for a handful did come back, though not as they were before. They spoke little, their eyes distant, their smiles thin and brittle. When pressed, they whispered of places without sun or moon, landscapes shaped not by earth but by vibration itself. They described halls of light that pulsed like living hearts, voices that never ceased, and figures who stood at the center of it all, four shapes cloaked in radiance, their mouths open in unending song. No one who heard these accounts doubted what they referred to: the sisters. The world tried to bury such stories under progress, under noise, under the march of industry. But the song was patient. It did not need belief. It only needed silence. And silence, no matter how modern the world became, always returned. In the pause before sleep, in the breath between heartbeats, in the quiet after a storm, it waited. Even now there are places where it leaks through. Villages abandoned without reason, their walls marked by spirals no tool could carve. Forest, paths where travelers vanish, leaving only shoes and half-finished songs. Coastlines where fishermen whisper of glowing lights beneath the waves. And sometimes, just sometimes in the dead of night, a family will wake to find their child standing at the window, eyes unfocused, lips moving in time with a melody no one else can hear. Skeptics dismiss it as folklore, as superstition woven from coincidence and fear. Yet the reports persist. They come from every corner of the world, in every language, in every century. They describe the same light, the same harmony, the same four voices blending into one. The question is not whether the song exists. The question is what it wants. Some believe it is calling humanity towards something greater, that the sisters are heralds of transformation, guiding us into a world beyond flesh and time. Others insist it is a trap, a lure cast into the sea of human minds reeling us toward an end we cannot comprehend. Both may be true, or neither. For the song does not explain. It only invites. There are recordings online now, grainy, distorted clips said to capture fragments of the melody. Most are hoaxes, a few are not. Those who listen too long claim the sound stays with them. At first, it hums in the background of daily life, a faint echo. But as days pass, it grows louder. They hear it in engines, in birdsong, in their own breath. Some vanish from their homes, leaving doors unlocked and meals unfinished. Others are found wandering highways at night, murmuring of lights beneath the horizon, and perhaps you, even as you hear these words, will wonder if the faint ringing in your ears is the song itself. If the silence between sounds is not empty at all, but full of something waiting. Perhaps you will wake one night certain that someone is singing just beyond your door, though no one stands there. Perhaps you will follow as so many before you have. The hollow house is gone. The sisters are unseen. Yet their music endures, threaded into the fabric of the world, carried in wind and water and blood. It asks nothing. It demands nothing, and yet it waits. Always, it waits. If you are quiet enough, if you allow yourself to listen, you may already hear it. A faint hum, low and steady, rising beneath your own heartbeat. A rhythm that is not yours, but feels as though it always has been. And once you hear it, truly hear it, you will never be alone again.